were like an hour and 15, I think.
Squirrel.
Yeah.
And I have sniffed so much Yeti that my head immediately became shaped for a flat brim.
When did you know you really liked Cameron?
We became buddies like immediately.
Like
Once
right
we
off the
became
bat?
Friends. Yeah. Well, I had him on my podcast. It's the first time I met him, and he brought me a Hoyt bow. So how could I not love him?
I did.
What did you think when that happened?
I thought I made it.
I love it.
I thought I finally made it.
This is Tim Burnett with Solo Hunter, and you're listening to my favorite podcast, The Gritty Bowmen.
I just Randy Black Eagle.
That's it. Boom.
That's my.
That's how we roll. Just drop the mic and walk away.
So I just did the death hike, and 40 miles is a long ways. He was one of those guys that understood the natives and how they lived, right? Somehow he was savvy enough to respect them enough to where he kind of developed a name, and they respected him as well. I believe he hiked in 4 days. It said that he hiked 160 miles in 4 days. That's a pretty tough dude.
He's a legendary white dude. Like there's no doubt.
Yeah, great white hunter trapper.
Right.
It's like, man, me and Boone would have been tight back in the day.
Yeah,
because
that's cool.
I would have had the same exact feelings over a lot of these adventures that he had.
Yeah. All right, folks, welcome to the Gritty Bowmen podcast. I'm here in Washington, right? Eatonville, Washington.
Yep.
With Ryan Lampers, and we actually read a book together. Not together at the same time, but we both read a book that we liked.
It was very good.
And I wanted to talk about it today because I think it's a neat book. It's a neat read, and I think other people might want to listen to it. It's got a lot of history in it, and it's about Daniel Boone. It's called Boone Biography by Robert Morgan. You can get it on Audible. There's a plug for Audible. Did you listen to it on Audible?
I did. Yep.
It's a good read.
Audible is very nice to have. I love it. I travel so much. It's like just the perfect. So.
And this is a good book. So Ryan texted me. He was on a trip, and he's like, "Hey, what's a good book to read?" And I'm like, "Well, what topic do you want to venture into? History? Do you want to go, tactics? You want fiction?" And Ryan settled on Boone.
I did. It's always been an interest. I think because of who he was and when he lived and where he lived and what he did, it definitely struck a chord with me. So that sounded pretty fascinating when he mentioned it, and it's like, man, that is perfect. That is right up my alley.
We both read the book, and so before we get into that, I wanted to give people that are watching or listening some context here. About Daniel Boone. So, Daniel Boone was born November 2nd, 1734. So, he's probably one of the more famous frontiersmen in American history. There
was a lot of actual books written about him while he was even still alive.
This biography talks about that.
Yeah. A lot of folks were intrigued. I think he was very well respected although in saying that, there's a lot of people that didn't respect him at the same time while he was alive. I think there was a little bit of jealousy in some respect, but his nature and how he was, how he treated people. It was he sounded like one of those guys that people had. As they got to know him, they just respected him. They trusted him. There was an immense trust amongst everybody that seemed to get to know Daniel Boone. So, pretty fascinating how he lived.
I was telling Ryan a little bit earlier, I wrote something in a journal right after I read the book, trying to put in context the timing of events with other parts of the world or American history. And this is what I wrote. And it goes something like this. So it was in context of Robert Robinson, who wrote Fount of Every Blessing, the hymn. It says, I wrote in here, it was written in, the Fount of Every Blessing was written in 1757 by Robert Robinson in England at age 22. The lyrics dwell on the theme of divine grace and are based on 1 Samuel 7:12. At this same period, Daniel Boone was age 23. He narrowly escaped death in the Battle of the, I forget Monongahela, a bitter defeat for the British in the French and Indian War. George Washington, the first president of the United States, was 25 years old at this time. The American Revolutionary War would not begin until 1775 and would continue to 1783. So this is back, back when it was the colonies and it was under English rule, British rule. Daniel Boone was a Quaker at birth and known as a fighting Quaker. He would explore the Cumberland Gap in 1767, which we'll get into a little bit later, which would eventually lead to the westward expansion of the United States. So much would be gained and lost during this period. As I study native cultures and mountain men and frontiersmen, the Great Awakening, I am moved by their descriptions of the natural world, of the Americas before European conquest. I am moved by the lives of the Native American Indians whose ideas of land ownership and material wealth differed so much from those of the white man. It seems these two cultures were so diametrically opposed that they were doomed to failure from the outset. But studying Daniel Boone and his love for the Indians and the Indians' respect for him in return, as different as all these people are, one thing was common among them: his belief in a creator. There are many, and I wrote a bunch of other stuff about it, but it kind of gives you an idea of this period of time. And we're dealing with George Washington as a young man at the same age as Daniel Boone. They're very close in age. I think they're like 2 or 3 years apart in age.
Right.
So, running in different circles, but still they're contemporaries.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things, there's lots of themes here and interesting, things that happen in the book that were very new to me, and some I knew. But let's talk about just sort of a brief overview of Daniel Boone as a young man, and kind of just progress through his life as the book does.
Sure. Yeah. What I found very interesting, and what kind of for me, there's not like a connection, but it seems like I respect guys that live the way he did. He had this intense desire to be wild and free, be out in the wilderness, be out hunting. He trapped. He did a lot of things like that, and that's where he was most comfortable. Where he was not most comfortable was being around a lot of folks. He just didn't have it in him to kind of stick to that. So yeah, as a child, I think his upbringing as a Quaker, he was very, I think they were kind of brought up as pacifists. He wasn't a guy out there looking to get into fights and wars, and yet he was a great fighter. I think he did a lot of wrestling and was very good and very strong, and he excelled at those things. But yeah, as it progresses and how he grows, it's incredible what young men back in those days did before they even hit 20 years old, right?
Right.
I mean, all the stories that he had of trips, of being alone, of being, out and about and doing all these incredible adventures before he even hits the age of 20 are just something that doesn't happen to us these days. But I don't know.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Like very much a woodsman. What I found interesting was his desire to be outside all the time.
Right.
To explore nature, to be in the wilderness, to have a passion for the outdoors that was beyond. He just was not into farming. He just had no interest in it whatsoever.
No. He did not seem to have a desire to hold on to possessions that had value as far as making money. Properties, sure, they came and went back when he got in the older years, but that was not a desire of his. It seems like every time he acquired something or he got into something, it always came back to him getting pulled back out into these wild places and wanting to explore. And back then, I mean, let's face it, who knows what you and I would have done back then in those days?
Yeah.
Probably something similar. Just wanted to always be out. But even at that point where there was all this wild country that hadn't been explored, it was full of Indians out there. It was a scary place. You know, it was also looked at as kind of crazy, kind of weird. You know, he got his name because he was out there doing these things. It's not like everybody was. There was a select few guys that were out there brave enough to kind of get out into the wilderness and these wild lands and actually be able to thrive and make it and trap and avoid capture. And
yeah, they would talk about him being gone for extensive periods of time, even as a young boy, and then coming back, but actually being able to do social occasions well.
Right.
Like being able to hang out and tell stories in front of a campfire, make people laugh, and kind of be involved and play that role. Like everybody seemed to like him. He had some charisma.
Right.
He was a natural leader. People wanted to follow him. If Daniel's doing it, I want to do it. But then also like just leave and be by himself for long periods of time.
Yeah, absolutely. Which usually you would think you wouldn't be so sociable. You wouldn't be the life of the party, so to speak, right? When you get back and you just kind of blend right in like you hadn't been gone at all.
But it did seem like, and I see this a lot with like Aaron Snyder or maybe you at times, where they're back in normal society and it's like they're hanging out and they're doing their thing, but really they're just thinking about going back out again.
Oh yeah, it's always there.
Like,
it's always on the ring.
Let's like it's sort of like you're playing the role and it suits you and it's fine.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not the goal. The goal is to get back out again.
It's always the goal.
Yeah.
That's why, you know, it's as weird as it is to say, I don't even know if I'm saying it right, but there is almost like this
kindred spirit thing.
Yeah, for sure. Because, you know, a lot, as I went through this and read this, it was so many different points throughout the stories where I thought, man, that is
relatable.
So relatable to how I feel, how my life is, and, you know, what I desire to go do. I mean, it is almost spot on with everything from business, you know, interests and failures and this and that versus how he thrived in the backcountry and just wild places.
And so let's talk about the country at the time. One of the things that I find fascinating about the book and about the read in this time period is we're talking about what the country looked like before westward expansion, before colonization by white people.
Right.
You know, or Europeans, I should say, really, into, or Spanish or whatever, into that whole, you know, part of the U.S. So they colonized the Americas, you know, we colonized that east side of the world there, but it's still a very wild and rugged place.
Sure.
And at this time, no one had been west of the Cumberland Gap,
right?
Really.
No, they were searching for a way to get through. They were searching for a good passageway through, right? And
right.
And that
so you got the Appalachian Mountains, right there. I'm no geography specialist, but basically to get further east, there was a mountain range in the way.
Further west, yeah,
or west. I mean,
yeah. There was a big mountain range, and it, by all accounts, it was treacherous. You know, it was steep. There was rocks. There was cliffs, and
weather.
Yeah, and you know, Native Americans, they had managed to travel back and forth on both sides of the Appalachians and find passageways through there, and had known about the gap. They could get into Kentucky, and it was kind of like this long lost place that was being seeked out, and Daniel Boone, he explored it and he kind of figured it out, and you know, made a name for himself exploring that country, learning the mountains, and he had a very good almost mind that remembered everything out there in the mountains. All these little he could draw a map afterwards and say, okay, there was this mountain here and it was 2 miles, blah blah blah. And so he remembered these wild places very explicitly, so he could go back.
Yeah, he had an uncanny way of being able to find his way.
Yeah. No GPS, like we're fortunate enough to have these days.
It didn't say he even really used a compass.
No. It was a lot about, I think remembering mountain ranges and the looks of things. And it
He has
sounded
some
like they
quotes
did
where-
some mapping, but
He has some quotes where he's like, "I've never been lost, but I've been misplaced for a week or two."
exactly. Yeah.
So definitely, I'm sure he wandered around for a while.
Kind of like all of us, right?
Yeah, that's how Aaron finds camp every night.
That's right.
But yes, he had that ability.
Yeah, and that's that's something that, again, before I had gotten into this and really dug deep, that was something I just kind of assumed more people back in that era had a better sense about
Where they were.
Yeah,
in the
traipse-
wilderness.
Yeah, getting through mountains, and but apparently not. That's not so. He had an uncanny ability, and there was a few guys back then that were well known for doing that. Native Americans, obviously, they'd been doing it for so long, and they had that same ability. Now, one of the things that was brought up over and over again was there was almost a oversight on a lot of Native Americans' part by assuming
Underestimated Boone.
they underestimated Boone and others for their ability to get through these mountain ranges, and they just figured that they'd go out there and die. It's so treacherous, it's so hard to get through, and it took Native Americans generations to figure out how to live in those mountains. They underestimated, and they just figured, well, they're out there, you're not going to make it,
Yeah.
But that wasn't the case with guys like Daniel Boone. So. Yeah.
Yeah, so when he goes out and explores, starts exploring, I found it fascinating because they're talking about, buffalo, elk, deer,
Bear.
bear.
Bear was a big one.
So many black bears.
Yeah.
And
There were stories of him in valleys where he would kill, 300 black bear in a season. And they would...
some incredible number by lunchtime, like 40 or something. I don't know. I don't know the numbers, but they were ridiculous.
And they enjoyed the meat, and they rendered down the bear fat in these, which they used all the rest of the year. Kind of like what I do now.
Yeah.
I use the heck out of that stuff, and it's one of those.
Yeah, he used
living off
the bear fat was they create bear butter. They did.
It was used for cooking. It was used for
soap. I think they used the bear fat for a lot of things.
I think back then even it was one of those things that they tried to sell as far as like I don't know why, but they thought it made your hair grow. It's like a tonic, magic tonic. They look at bears and they're like, holy cow, look at all the
maybe
look at all the hair they got. But that was something that still
they
to
talked
this
about,
day they actually sell.
Yeah,
that
they
stuff.
talked about bear bacon too, and they really talked about bears as being a main food source and staple food.
Yeah.
For the people, and then they had the hides and other uses too, but the bear fat was pretty important.
It was, absolutely. That was used for a lot of things. They didn't have what we have now, oil extraction and all that. It's pretty fascinating. Bear fat, salt. They had these salt mines where they would get salt. They had, how they figured all these things out kind of blows my mind, as far as like tapping maple trees and collecting the sweet
syrup.
The water out of it and then boiling it down. And I know how that process works. I do it at my property in Washington. It's just such a process. You always scratch your head and think, well, how did they figure out how to boil that stuff down? Because it is kind of a unique process to get 10 gallons of that sap will give you a very small amount of maple syrup.
And they would tap all these trees.
Yeah.
And then collect it all.
Yeah, and a lot of it. And that was the main source of income for him
a couple
and
of
his
times
wife.
for a few years.
It seemed like whenever he ran into financial difficulty,
he went back to the frontier.
He went back to trapping. He went back to tapping maple trees.
The wilderness. Yeah.
The wilderness.
Salt.
Yep.
Bears. So, as he moves across, what I loved about the book was the picture that they painted of just the what the land was like, what the natural resources were like. Now, there was also the book clearly highlighted the conflict that was at play between Daniel Boone, being this person who is of Quaker descent, that is of European descent. He believes in there's this westward expansion theme,
Right.
where in divine or providence, and like they're here to more or less eliminate, like the Jeffersonian principle, the whole eliminate the wildlife and turn it into farmland and agriculture.
Yeah.
They
Daniel Boone was not a farmer, didn't like anything about it. He wanted to be out doing things and hunting, and that's kind of he always seemed to. He had an issue with every time he moved to a place. He felt like if another neighbor moved in and took up a parcel of land within 10 miles of him, he felt like he was just, this place is too crowded for me. They're following me, right? And that's what people tended to do with that westward expansion is, as he moved out of these forts, these small towns, people tended to follow.
Yeah.
And that's how it expanded and expanded. And as much as he did not like that process,
he still contributed to it.
He did, yeah.
I talked about this with Shane Mahoney a little bit, and he had a really great insight on this. But it did kind of, I found it like, what a catch-22, or this conundrum where he's like, I want to move west and explore these places, and I'm paid well to explore and to open up these roads and to move into these places like Kentucky. That's like this promised land. He's there before other people are, and he's able to it's like the land of milk and honey, and he's able to see and observe the beauty of the natural world in a way that after westward expansion comes through, I don't remember how many years it was, like it was something short, like 10 years. After people had made their way into Kentucky, the whole thing looked completely different.
Right.
Like everything that he had seen and done before was gone.
Yeah.
Animals were gone.
Yeah. Property lines were drawn, which he was a huge part of.
Mm-hmm.
And it completely changed everything about his wilderness.
They talked about the prairies and the grasslands, and they're gone.
Yeah.
The forest's gone. Like,
yeah. What I found really interesting with him is, he had this, and it was very controversial because he was one of those guys that understood the natives and how they lived, right? Mm-hmm. He admired them, he respected them because he would often run across them out in the woods while he was hunting, and he learned from them. But he also avoided capture. It was kind of a scary time to be traipsing around in the woods, especially in his younger years. And having the threat of being killed or captured, or he was everything from just running trap lines and having these valuable furs, getting those stolen, and somehow he was savvy enough to respect them enough to where he kind of developed a name, and they respected him as well. They started to realize and recognize who Daniel was over the years, and
he's a legendary white dude. Like there's no doubt.
Yeah, great white hunter, trapper.
Right. But that's the thing I wanted to bring up too, and I told you this on the phone when we were talking about it, or when I was mentioning the book. I was like, dude, man, can you imagine going and hunting, and let's say you pick your place, like New Mexico. You're going in there to hunt elk, right? There's no other people in there except for hostile Indians who might kill you.
Sure. And
now you're out there for a year hunting among those hostile people, but laying low. You're shooting critters, you're trapping stuff. At any point, you could get caught or seen by any Indian,
right?
Any Native American, and be killed.
Yeah,
scary. And would you still go out and do it?
I like to think I would back then. I don't know if there would have been too much enticing me back in town or back at the little fort that they've got. So,
and how many dudes did it?
Not very many. It didn't seem like.
And how many of them lived when they did?
Yeah, I don't know.
Not very many.
And that.
Let me answer you. Most of them did get killed by an Indian.
A lot of them. Yep. Killed, scalped. And that's, I think, why he got so many dang stories written about him. He was one of the few that survived it and made it through.
I mean, he talks about going through, I think it was when they went through the Gap, and his son was with him. And they got pretty far through, but the horses, something, I don't recall exactly the story, but they needed to go back and get some more supplies. So he sent his son and another person back. And they were heading back, but they were camped not far apart, like a mile or something, 2 miles. I don't remember. It was pretty close, but far enough that they were separate. And in the middle of the night, his son, they got ambushed by Indians and then tortured and killed.
Right.
Right. It's not an uncommon story during this period of time. And the Indians were like, hey, we don't want them coming through the gap. We don't want the white people here. We don't want westward expansion. And this is our land. And you already took that over there. That's yours. Why are you taking more? And if you come into our land, we're going to kill you.
Right. Well, yeah, there's a lot of competition as well, as guys like him, not trophy hunters, but hunters out there making a
market
living.
Hunters,
market hunters,
trappers.
They were out there trying to make a living on something that the Shawnee were just trying to survive on, following the buffalo herds and, elk and deer and bear and all that. And these areas were pretty rapidly getting hunted out because of the market hunting and trapped out. And yet, Daniel, he had to just keep moving and moving and moving and moving westward and north-south. And he just got to explore all the more because of that, because of the fact that they were getting hunted out.
And they talked about, like, he'd sleep in some kind of willow thicket.
Sure.
Where it's just like a cornfield, so thick that no one can, find you or.
Yeah, just imagine back then having guys out there looking to hunt you, and you've got to shoot your gun. I mean, that's how you supported yourself. That's what he was out there to do. You got to stay warm, right? You got to build a fire every once in a while. Pretty. You're
talking about building fires in caves and in slopes and things where the smoke would be hidden, and it's crazy. Like the idea today, we lived in, like Karen says, we're all softer than baby poo. So the idea of living in a place where you're risking your life to go and get these furs and all these different things, but you could be killed, not just killed, but killed in an unpleasant way.
Sure.
By an Indian.
Oh yeah, they were tortured. There was a lot of torturing.
There was a lot of heinous death, man. Like, and so to me, it's fascinating to see what is it that drives a man to go out and do that, and it wasn't money.
No, it wasn't money at all. He had bills and he had a family at a certain point, but he would be away from his family for months. I don't know exactly how long, more than that, maybe years. And he would be away, and sometimes he'd come back with nothing but experiences. Sometimes he would make some in the trapping, and it would get stolen from him by the Shawnee Indians. And
there were times where he talked himself out of getting killed, basically.
Yeah, he was very, from the stories that were told, he could talk himself out of those situations by humor. Also, he had a lot of skills that a lot of the natives respected. Gun making, for example, kind of a blacksmith. He was kind of a do-it-all type guy. So he was very valuable in a way. In fact, when he did get captured by some Shawnees, he helped them out. He helped them build and fix their rifles that were used in warring with the Europeans. It was pretty fascinating, and that contributed to him, obviously, by a lot of folks calling him a traitor.
Right.
There was a lot of higher-ups that did not like Daniel Boone because he was so comfortable as a captured, as he was captured, he was comfortable there. He was smiling. He was helping them out.
Right. There's that story where he and a group of men were by the salt mines.
Yep.
And basically the Indians are like, hey, we're going to go and kill those guys. And he's like, well, what if I can get them all to surrender? Right. That's the story from Daniel's perspective. So they go and they get all the men, and then they go and he negotiates that they don't kill them. And then they adopt Daniel as a son, Blackfish chief of the Shawnee.
Yep.
And there's a story there where he genuinely enjoys the Indians' company and laughs and hangs out with them. And there's a true appreciation that goes both ways.
Yeah.
And other men who were there with him saw that and really despised the fact that he seemed to prefer, or even not necessarily prefer, but be content with hanging out with a bunch of Indians in their culture.
Yeah, and I think, he respected what they did, and that went a long way. I think that saved his life in a ton of different scenarios.
And theirs, although...
Yeah. I mean, what I think is so different from him versus other folks is he just fit in with those guys. He liked to hunt like they did. That's why Blackfish adopted him. He helped them better the tribe. And yeah, he could be a slick talker if he needed to be. But that was basically how he survived, and the only way he was going to survive. So that was kind of the controversy back then, right? Is that being a traitor, saving your own hide, and then later when you escape, coming back and fighting for, he fought in Boonesboro to try to defeat that same Shawnee tribe that was going to go attack Boonesboro.
He knew what their plan was because he'd been hanging out with them.
He had actually made an agreement with Blackfish that he would get the town of Boonesboro to surrender. Mm-hmm. He made that agreement, but he went back on, as honest as he went back on that agreement. Obviously got to Boonesboro. That's where his family was.
He escaped.
He escaped
being there,
And I think if I remember right, so I just did the death hike, and 40 miles is a long ways. I believe he hiked in 4 days. It said that he hiked 160 miles in 4 days. That's a pretty tough dude.
Well, we were talking about this earlier. He lived to be 85.
Yeah.
So
back then.
With all the Indians trying to kill you, all the diseases, all the cold, the elements, the whole deal.
You'd think just the stress of living in that day and age, right, would just...
And a lot of his contemporaries, they did. They died at age 30, 50, 40. They died.
Maybe that says something for getting out into the wild places, because he was one of the few that lived to be that old. And he was, again, one of the few that did venture and keep exploring and just keep after it.
I think, it also, though, goes to show how robust his constitution was, his health in general. I think he's like a diesel truck. He's just tough and could keep going.
Well, and I think his fortitude with wanting to explore. He was kind of like a lot of hunters that I associate with today that you and I know. There's some guys that just have a desire to be out there. They've got this push. Aaron's probably one of those guys. They've got this drive, and it's a motor that some people just don't have.
Yeah.
And guys like that, like he was too stubborn, and he had too much to learn and too much to see and explore to go die in some village. Mm-hmm. So,
yep, I agree. And so I think, he definitely was tough. When he makes that escape, it is like a legendary escape. It's a long distance.
I believe how the story went was they were the group, Blackfish and some other of the warriors and some of the women. They were kind of, I think, going to get water or something like that. And some of the group saw a bunch of turkeys over in a tree. So the warriors all grabbed their rifles and took off, and they left Daniel there with the ladies. And so Daniel saw that as his opportunity, his one opportunity, and he had been captured for quite a while.
They'd been watching him for a while.
Yeah, and they were very aware that he would probably try to escape. Well, that was his one opportunity. He cut the leashes off the horse, and he took off, and he ended up ditching the horse at some point. I don't know exactly why, if it was because of the trackability of the horse versus him, because it wasn't that far where he lost that horse, and then he went on foot the rest of the way to Boonesboro. Just imagine that kind of distance.
Yeah.
Trying to navigate without a compass, without a GPS, navigate mountains just by sight, that, a remembrance of you being there before.
With people who are arguably some of the best woodsmen in the world,
trying to
Native
get
Americans
trying to
tracking
catch
you to catch you
Yeah.
and to make you pay.
Yeah,
And they know where you're going,
right.
right? It's not
They
like
knew
they
he
can't.
was going to Boonesboro.
Right. You just head him off.
Right.
Get in front of him.
But somehow he snaked his way up rivers and down rivers, and you avoid detection. And they tracked him for a while, but they didn't end up catching him. He got there first. Only took him 4 days.
Yeah.
So, yeah, impressive.
And when he fights in the battle at Boonesboro, it's pretty amazing, pretty intense story.
Yeah.
I think his son is killed there, another son, or somewhere as a result of that period. And I think those were hard things for Daniel Boone.
Right.
They talk about the loss of his sons.
Yeah, I think, for him, he was kind of one of those natural leaders, right? He was he was respected for it. Most men, although he may not have been the leader, like in a certain fort or whatever, there may have been men in a certain amount of power higher than him that made the final decision. Most of the men tended to follow what he was saying. And one of his great, one of the things that I think he just could not get over in life is that time where he allowed somebody to make him mad to the point where he made a bad decision. They were standing on a riverbank. They knew it was he knew it was a bad situation. He felt like if we just cross this river here, what he wanted to do was send guides over to scout it to see
because he could tell it was an ambush point.
Yeah, he knew with all his experience this is a bad place to cross. But the guy that was ahead of him, and I don't recall his name, he flared up and basically called him a coward. And in front of all those men, instead of keeping his cool, he lost it. And he said, "I'll show you," basically type thing. And he ended up crossing that river. And all in all, his son got killed, and it was a massacre.
Yep.
And he never forgave himself for that. He just lost his cool one of those times that he did.
Well, again, I mean, that's where you let your ego run away with you.
Yep.
And you made a choice that you regret the rest of your life.
Right.
All because of your own darn pride.
Yep. He knew better, but he allowed somebody to get in his head.
And he never did that before. He was remarkably, calculated in so many things. And it just was a moment of weakness because he normally didn't have that.
Right.
Fall prey to that temptation.
Right. Yep.
So, yeah, his son died as a result of that. It was a very interesting read to hear how that whole, how he never forgave himself.
Yeah. Yeah. And it just, kind of one of his skills or traits that was really respected is his way to get out of situations. I mean, you had 400 soldiers, there's 400 warriors out there basically looking to overthrow Boonesboro.
It was just a fort, basically.
Just a fort, 300 yards away, ready to overtake them. But with Daniel there in the fort, they did all kinds of these little shenanigans to try to make it look like they had more people. I don't remember how many folks they had, whether it was 60 or 80 people.
It was pretty good trickery.
Yeah, they didn't have a whole lot of people to defend this fort. And deep down, Daniel knew, even though they had kind of a high ground, they had a pretty well-maintained fort, that they would probably lose this battle. But through all the trickery, he got through it, and they lived. And it seemed like there was one point where he just kind of knew that was the end, and yet he managed to pull through it just by outsmarting the chief that was on the other side looking to overthrow Boonesboro.
And that interplay was fascinating because he did seem to truly value his adopted father.
Yeah. Yep.
And yet he is forced to pick a side, and he
picked
time and time again he picked the Europeans.
Yeah, and his
people,
his trustworthiness was called to play from both sides, right? In that scenario, because there was a meeting set outside the fort, like 60 yards from the fort. They had riflemen in the fort looking to protect Daniel. And he met out there 60 yards with Blackfish to try to talk this thing through. And Blackfish reminded him that you promised me that you would surrender Boonesboro. You made that deal. And Daniel knew he was caught. And he knew that he had made that promise. But he felt more obliged to support the men back at Boonesboro than the other side, which went a long way because up until that point, there was a lot of people that considered him to be a traitor. But, obviously he respected both sides, but his family, some of his family was in that fort at that time.
What I find fascinating about the whole thing is the conflict that he's going through on both sides, because he truly does value the indigenous cultures. He doesn't want to see their way of life lost. He doesn't want to see all the game killed out. He doesn't want to see it, the place overrun with cities and towns. But he also loves, his family, his Quaker upbringing. He values, civilization as well. And here's a man who's in both places on both sides and values them both.
Right.
And is watching their interplay right before his eyes. And I often wonder when I read the book and since, how did he reconcile that? Mm-hmm. How did he deal with those differences and decide what to do?
Yeah, I found myself asking the same thing. It almost seemed like there was a point where he was just going to, forget about his past and go live with the Shawnee people.
Yep.
And be comfortable with them. But he didn't do that. He always tended to kind of veer back. And he'd find new settlements and new places and new challenges just by, he was always moving. He kept moving and he kept hitting new places. And yet his reputation tended to follow him, not just through the Europeans, not just through his side, but throughout native cultures, new tribes that he'd never met before, but his reputation preceded him.
Shane Mahoney said, nations like people are full of contradictions. Right. And that in some ways it could have been simply the fact that Daniel Boone knew that it was inevitable.
Right.
He knew how many white people there were. He knew what Europe looked like. He knew how many people were coming across, and that westward expansion was going to happen whether he played a role or didn't play a role.
Yeah.
And since he loved being out there, he's like, I'm going to play a role. Or he said the other thing is maybe he held on to some naive hope that he could still do that, be part of westward expansion, work for these different companies, blaze a trail, but that it wouldn't all disappear.
Right. Yeah, he was very good at kind of playing both sides because, he did a lot of the things that the natives were doing as far as getting out there and continuing to explore and challenge himself that way and hunt and trap and even into a ripe old age. But he also played a little bit of a politician, and he made some pretty valuable, important decisions on the other side as well. He got into land survey, something that was just a complete debacle back in that area. Yeah. I don't know that anybody.
If you were a lawyer, you could have probably profited greatly.
Well, think about it back then, right? So these blocks of land, these little 160-acre blocks, they'd get these homesteads. And so you go out and you'd have one guy survey this 160-acre block. Well, maybe he registers it for somebody and they pay him for it. Maybe another surveyor came in and surveyed that same block for another guy. So there was at times different people thinking that they own the same piece of land, and a lot of the lines overlapped. Yeah, there was a lot of that going on. So lawyers just had a field day with it. Didn't matter who you were as a surveyor. There was just no survey office back then that was keeping track on a computer trying to figure out exactly how things were. So there was a lot of lawsuits. And you kind of feel sad for him in a way because it was a no-win situation for anybody in those times.
It seemed like the ones that won were those that had money and were very political.
Yeah, for sure.
Which Daniel, let's face it, as much as he could do that, he was a woodsman. Yeah. He didn't play politician very well.
No, even in arenas where he probably should have, he tended to kind of show up in his hunting clothes and not a coonskin cap, but maybe a beaver cap.
Yeah, totally. That's another myth, right?
It's one of those myths about Daniel Boone.
So recount the story where he rescues his daughter Do you know? Do you have that one?
I don't really. I kind of forget. I forget that one. But yeah, it's funny when you go through this book. It's a lot of different stories. Some of them kind of mesh, and they can kind of piece together stories and situations and timelines. Yep. Some of them are a little bit different from, a lot of what this book, where it came from, was his kids. Accounts from his kids and his daughters and sons, and they talked about what Daniel had said to them at certain points in time. Talked about how he possibly had wives in some Indian tribes, a Cherokee wife, possibly a Shawnee wife, possibly, just by little quotes that they recalled from him saying. And that's kind of how this book is pieced together. So it's interesting how there's different accounts, and you don't really know 100% sure if that's how it happened, but they try to piece it together enough to where you kind of have a good idea that it did. But yeah, I don't recall how he saved, I think her name was Jemima.
Yeah, his daughter, I think they were just boating for fun or something on the river. They weren't supposed to cross to the other side. They were like careless. There were a group of Indian boys, young men that were on the other side. And they were like, dude, we could totally grab these 3 white girls. And they did. I think it was 4 guys. They grabbed the girls. They were very nice to the girls, according to Jemima and her story. I think that was her name, his daughter's name. Yeah. They tell the story. The men were a little rough with them at first, but then once they get going, they were pretty darn nice, and they were taking him to the village. This isn't uncommon for native cultures. Like, at the time, they would kidnap people from different tribes, and then they would adopt them and make them part of their own. Right. And it's just very common. Right. And, they also would kill people, too, that they kidnapped if they didn't like them.
Well, right? Who knows? Who knows, if Daniel Boone would have been captured at a different point in time. Yeah. And he didn't have so many skills that he was able to afford to them, like to help them in their rifle building, and there's black.
Or didn't have humor, or he just wasn't charismatic,
he
or
wasn't
whatever.
Affable guy, they probably would have killed him right off.
Yeah. So they're sitting there and they're telling the story, and the daughters, and anyway, they get kidnapped, and they're pretty nice. Well, Daniel Boone, they hear them screaming or something like that. They go and immediately they try to find her. Well, the whole time the daughters are leaving. Like it's like something in a movie, right? Like The Last of the Mohicans or something, where they're tearing pieces of their dress off and sticking them on trees. They're breaking branches, and they're making themselves trackable. The Indians kind of figure it out, and they're like, knock it off, but they keep doing it, and the men from the town are tracking the Indians, and they track them for a long, long way. And anyway, they are able to, because the girls are slowing them down, and they're flirting, or not necessarily flirting, but they're interacting, and there's actually some niceness there, right? And later, the girls will say that the Indians were really actually nice to them and treated them well, but they engage in a dangerous game, right? They kidnap these girls, and as they get further and further away, the Daniel gets closer and closer, and he's able to close the gap on them. And they ambush the boys, and I think they killed 2 of the 4 or 3 of the 4 or something like that, or all of them. I can't remember. But in part of the rescue, a lot of the Indian dudes go down, if not all. I can't recall, but they rescue her and they take her back And I recall her saying something like, someone asked her about the Indians, and she had said, they felt a little bad about it because they actually were really, really nice to the girls, and she defended them to somebody who was talking about them in a bad way. So it's kind of interesting, right? It's just, man, what a unique time.
Oh yeah. Yeah, where, just thinking about like hiking out into the mountain right here and possibly coming across somebody that's out there hunting just like you, and there's ill feelings towards your people, and you pay the price.
Yep.
Yeah.
So he does that rescue, and that is something. So what it builds up to is this legendary, all these stories, right, about Daniel Boone, all these like harrowing tales, and someone writes a book about Daniel Boone, and another person, and pretty soon, in his own time frame, in his own period, while he's still alive,
right,
he becomes famous. But it's ironic because he can't really use that fame to make any money.
He is one poor dude for most of his life. Right?
Yeah.
He never made it. There was at one point where he had some
Extremely
money,
famous,
but he lost it
but
very
poor.
quickly. Yeah. I think Filson was the guy's name that wrote the book.
That's right.
And
he died like 5 years after he wrote the book.
Yeah. But it's fascinating because a lot of the books were completely contradictory, like different stories about this man, this mountain man. But all of the books seem to have this respect, and it's kind of like a novelty back. He was this not almost beyond human type guy.
Yeah.
Coonskin cap, he could fight anybody, and he'd shooting bears wrestling bears with his hands.
Killing Indians.
Yeah, killing Indians. Almost, larger than life. And yet, he was really just more of a kind of a kind soul, wanted to be out there in the wild, and he really did not want the kind of fame and fortune. He was famous. He was very famous at that time. Obviously, the books and everybody knew of him, even through the tribes, the Shawnees and the Cherokees. They all knew of him, and respected him. I don't know how. I don't know how that traveled back then. I mean, I can't imagine how word spreads.
I mean, yeah,
like to a man's character, which is
Small
what
world.
got him his fame.
Yeah.
Yeah, you'd like to think in today's world, right, that you would live like that and gain that respect just by being truthful, being an honest guy, and having good character. And
there were still people for years that didn't trust him.
Sure,
Yeah.
And a lot of that stemmed from him associating with
Indians,
right,
Yeah.
and respecting Indians, and he didn't have a whole lot of bad things to say about them.
What I really found interesting, though, is when you look at Indian culture. So let's take a look at that, talk about that a little bit. You look at Indian culture and how they viewed Native American Indian, how they viewed the world versus how white settlers viewed the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I think back then it was completely different. I think most of the white folks around those forts, they were looking for land. They were looking for money. They were looking for things to hold on to.
Ownership.
Wealth. That's perfect.
I think
word.
it sounds
Ownership and
greedy,
wealth.
but I don't think that. I think it's more they're looking for security.
Yeah.
Future.
Yeah, it may not be a bad thing. It's just completely at opposite ends of what the natives were looking more to live and thrive and feed their families, feed their people. They weren't acquiring things for wealth. Wealth was kind of not on the radar until the settlements came around, where it was actually a thing.
Do you think that's true though? Like when you talk about wealth, I think that wealth can be viewed in different ways because,
sure.
I've heard Native Americans talk about wealth being relationships,
sure,
and family. I'm rich in family. I'm rich in experience.
Yeah, that kind of wealth, absolutely. I think that was definitely the case. Wealth in environment, where they lived, a food source. That was wealth in their eyes. The buffalo herd was strong, the elk herd was strong.
Because if you think about wealth, and because I don't think the Native Americans saw themselves as poor or seeking a life of poverty. I want to be careful about that because when we talk about how they didn't want to have wealth,
sure,
I think in some ways it's like, well, they didn't. They thought they already had wealth because you hear them talk about how they didn't care about owning a farm, and in fact, they disdained farming as something like akin to slavery. And they talk about this saying, well, a Native American would never want to go out and plant crops and work in a field and do all this crud to raise corn and all this kind of stuff when you could just go out and get something and then be done.
Right. Well, that's how they'd been for so long, very nomadic, very mobile. That's how, which I think
But I think they saw the farming and all that stuff as like a very poor man's way of living, a very poor in soul type of lifestyle.
And that's interesting because that's probably exactly how Daniel Boone would describe it. Listening to some of the stories,
even as a little boy, like
he
7, 8, 9 years old,
absolutely did not want to be in that field farming. He absolutely hated it.
He thought it was like hunting. Slavery.
Yeah. When he could be out hunting for sure.
Why raise cattle when you
that's where me and Daniel Boone we cross paths. That is not the case with me for sure. So we're completely different there because I love gardening.
But gardening and farming,
a big farmer, but I love.
I would say that's
crops.
different. I'd say Native Americans
grew crops too.
I'd say they did gardening. They just didn't do farming.
No, they didn't settle on
mass
pieces
cultures and monoculture something.
Sure,
for profit and sell.
Right,
different.
Yep.
I think they grew a little bit here and there for food,
absolutely, to
augment their hunter-gatherer lifestyle.
Right.
But so in that regard, I don't think you're that far off.
But yeah. Do you remember what was one of those prized pieces of meat? Do you remember that in the book? What was one of the prized pieces of meat that was brought up several times
for Native Americans?
Yeah, as a gift. It's not very prized in today's world. It's the tongue.
I was going to say tongue.
Yeah, it's the tongue. Like buffalo tongue was very that was wealth right there. That was something that you'd give to folks as a prize.
Yeah.
And in today's world, it's not the case. But I tell you what, it should be.
Yeah.
Well, it definitely should be.
Well, and that's what I'm getting at is what I thought was really fascinating was how the idea of wealth was different for the Native American versus the settlers, European settlers, because it seemed like Native American culture, valued, experiences or valued relationships, valued adventure,
right,
a lot. Where the European culture seemed to value ownership, having large tracts of land. They were definitely engaged in seeking wealth and more possessions and more goods and more status. And
completely relatable to Daniel and how he lived, because he would acquire possessions, right? But he didn't care about them. Because if he did, he would do the proper paperwork to get these properties locked in, but he never would, and he would continuously lose these possessions. It just didn't have a spot in his heart to have this stuff. I think he felt like it bogged him down because he had that spirit where he just continued to want to move west and explore rivers that had, all these new trapping opportunities and hunting lands, promised lands, if you will. And
so, tell me this, how did the Indians, because they were confused by the way the white man seemed to operate.
Sure. Yeah.
And, to me, it looked like they were they didn't understand farming. They didn't understand ownership. What do you mean you're going to, you own this whole thing?
Right.
That was, very foreign to them.
Right. Yeah, for nomadic people that are used to following the game, picking up and moving, they just didn't have, it's just my opinion, but they just didn't have, that wasn't a thing for them to have a tract of land and say, this is mine. This is mine and you can't come on it.
I think that when these two cultures ran up against each other and the white people just kept encroaching and moving in and taking places and stuff, that it inevitably would lead to war.
Sure.
Yeah. And I think one of the things, some of the quotes that were in the book were around how the Native Americans viewed the extirpation or elimination of animals in certain places where they used to be. All the buffalo were gone.
Right.
And then there was no more. It's it broke their hearts.
Yep.
Where, for people, one thing, and the reason I bring it all up is because it's one thing I really highly value about Native American culture is how they truly valued all animals,
Mm-hmm.
the natural world in general.
Mm-hmm.
They valued it in a way that the Europeans did not.
Mm-hmm.
They saw the natural world through a lens of everything is valuable. All creatures are valuable. All this space is valuable, and we need to use it responsibly. Where the whites that came across were like, we need to kill all the cougars and wolves and eliminate this and get rid of the buffalo because they interfere with our cattle. And we need to farm this whole thing, cut it down. And they were turning it into, these vast tracts of farmland. And they saw the world in a very narrow view that suited their immediate needs, but they did not see the natural world, in a way of balance like the Native American did.
No, absolutely. No, I agree. I think you're right. I mean, I think that translates today as well, doesn't it?
I think so.
I think there's a lot of that. I wish I knew. I wish I could have lived in that era, honestly. I've told my wife this so many times. I think I missed my calling. I would have loved to have been.
You're born in the wrong time.
I think so. I would have loved to have seen those days, just because of the wildness and just getting out there and being able to cover so much land. Yeah, it was scary. Yeah, there was a lot of dangers out there, a lot more dangers than we have today to deal with.
No,
but
I think it's amazing because when you read about the rivers and the plants and the grasses and the trees and the things that were there before westward expansion.
Sure.
It's like, it's a different planet.
Yeah.
An utterly different world. It's like Africa untouched.
Yep.
It's like this Serengeti. Like I read American Serengeti, and it's like, we really messed it up.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, just imagine. As I was listening to this and going through it, it was, I kept thinking to myself, what that must have been like, just crossing a river, just getting through that Cumberland Gap and pushing westward and getting to the Missouri and moving up into that country. What that must have been like. Think of how hard it would have been just to, you come up against a giant river like the Missouri and you got to get across that thing. There's a promised land on the other side.
Yeah.
Think how hard that would have been. You would have to spend some time. You'd have to build some boats. And everything was a process, and everything was, there was just so much more ingenuity back then. And that's what I respect. That's what I miss. I respect that.
Well, I would say there's a lot of ingenuity today.
Yeah, sure.
But the difference is that everyone almost had to employ ingenuity back then, whereas
if
today
you were going to take
kind of coast.
Yeah, there's ingenuity that was built for us today.
Yeah.
You had to be your own creator at that point.
Yeah.
You had to know how to put up 4 walls and build yourself a little shed.
Dude, you had to figure out how to hunt in Indian country without getting killed.
You had to figure out how to make clothes to get yourself through a winter.
Boone talked about, waking up moments before an attack and like sneaking out of camp many times.
Yep.
The dude seemed to sleep with one eye open, or have an innate sixth sense for hearing things or picking up on things.
Yeah.
Because others seem to sleep right on through till the tomahawk hit him in the head. Right? Like, how did he? It's almost like there was some divine providence watching over the man. Like
some type of instinct that he had that must not be taught. It's just in him,
because he escaped
countless
stuff like that
raids.
all the time.
Yep, countless raids, and he did get caught,
or he got feelings that
a couple times.
This isn't right. I need to move.
Yeah,
and then sure enough,
sure.
Right after he moved, he would have been caught or killed.
Yep. And there's actually a story in there where there's a point in his life where he's out there trapping, and it's almost as if. Okay, he's run these several trap lines. He's got a pretty good stockpile going. He's almost to that point where he's thinking, well, anytime now they're about to find me and they're going to take all my trappings, all my hides, because there was at that point that was worth a lot of money. Right. It was highly valuable, but he was still out there, and it was almost like they knew where he was at times, and he would allow them to come get those, and that just afforded him more time to go get a bunch more hides and stay there, because yeah, they would come and they would almost know, like, they wouldn't kill him. You know, a lot of trappers were probably just killed, scalped, and left for dead at that point. They take the hides. But he was so good at trapping, and he had such a good relationship with the tribes, that it was almost like they would just have a good laugh every time that they would come into camp. He would have his hide there. They'd take them, and then it was just like, well, I gotta go refill my stock, and it's just another adventure, right? You just keep going.
So after having read the book, you know, and you've had time to reflect on it, what is one of the things that is a big takeaway for you? Something that you learned that maybe has changed who you are now or how you think about things?
Oh boy, how I think, how it's changed me. Honestly, I think and I don't know if this is arrogant to say, but I truly did, and I said this before, I truly did find myself having this over and over and over and thinking, that's what I would have done. That's something that I was bad at business. I would have made those same moves. I wouldn't have done the paperwork correct, and I would have had that pull to just continue out west and continue to find new country and new wild places, and so that was the one thing that, you know, before really going through this book, that really kind of struck a chord with me in that respect. It's like, man, me and Boone would have been tight back in the day.
Yeah.
Because I would have had the same exact feelings over a lot of these adventures that he had. Yeah. So I don't know. What about you? What did you get out of it?
A couple of things. I feel like I'm you know, anytime you read stories about something like this, I decided, you know, I want to know even more or be better at being in the wilderness. You know, have more skills, you know, more woodcraft under my belt.
Sure.
Right. That's something I kind of took away from that, and I've got other books to study that survival kind of stuff and backcountry woodcraft. I feel like I also, I always have, but I have an even deeper respect for Native American cultures. And I think I see, you know, I look at, it makes me question what I value in life, what I perceive as wealth. I don't see, you know, wealth and success and value the same way that I did a long time ago. You know, and it changes all the time, but I look at experiences as being worth far more to me. You could be gone tomorrow. Right. Playing it safe, 9 to 5, doing your typical stuff, you know, not taking risks or going down, you know, really experiencing, I think, nature. I think it's hard to live life like that to me. And I think I put more value in the natural world than I ever have before, too. I think that there's a connection that the human body, human spirit, human mind has to the outdoors and to the natural world. And the more you can connect with that, like Daniel Boone did, and others, the more you appreciate, you know, the natural world that's out there, and you become part of it. And hunting is part of that, you know. Yeah. The more you do that, the more I feel like you're really going back to your roots and living life more fully, I think. And it's hard to do when you never go outdoors. Right. And you never hunt, and you never put yourself in these situations that are challenging and difficult, you know, in the natural world. So,
yeah, and I think that's where I get some respect for the guy, just because of what those challenges that he did. They weren't easy; they were hard. You know, some of the things that we tackle today, they're not easy. They're pretty difficult. We could stay home. We could just hang out on the couch and watch television all day. But you know, I find myself, you know, yeah, I've got a family. I've got a great wife. I've got 2 kids. They keep me grounded. They keep me, you know, semi-home for for a lot of the year. If I didn't have them, though, I think I'd want to challenge myself even more, being out there more and doing that kind of thing, similar to him. He would come out of the hills a lot, hang with his family for a while, and then go back.
Yeah.
Something pulled him back in. And I think he kind of pushed it off as I got to go make some money.
Yeah.
Although he could have stayed back, tapped maple trees,
Yeah.
hung out in civilization, and probably just had a nice, comfortable lifestyle. Sitting around those settlements and those forts and being content.
Yeah.
But he had a spirit about him that always wanted to see new places. And I've told my wife this a million times. She's got this desire to go travel, right?
Uh-huh.
She wants to go see Europe, and she wants to go see all these different countries.
Yeah.
And I just don't have that. I just, for whatever reason, just here in the United States, there's so much maybe it's because I've been on the edges of so many wildernesses, and it feels like I haven't even touched them. There's just so much to see in there. I'm perfectly content if I have 10 days off, just going into a wilderness around here, heck, in Washington or Oregon or Idaho or Montana, and just being completely content and getting more out of that than going to some far off place. Because we still have some great wild places to go venture and see and take risks and challenge ourselves and our bodies. But yeah, that's kind of what I got out of it is just kind of some, similarities, I guess.
Yeah.
And there's this thing that kind of pulls you back into civilization at times.
Yeah.
But there's also this other pull going the other direction, and you kind of have to balance it.
I think I heard Ranella talk about civilization is great. That's where you get like Chinese food and,
Sure.
you get like these different things, right? Like there's some good things out of this civilization thing, but then there's these great things about wild and and nature and
I think going and hanging out at in some fancy restaurant somewhere in downtown Seattle or something like that, man, that is, some folks, they get a kick out of that. That's like a highlight of their week.
Yeah,
that would be a low part of my week. I think
I can appreciate that restaurant, but I just don't value it like many people do.
Yeah, and that's fine. We all have our own things that we enjoy and we like. But for some of us, having wild places out there, knowing they're there and they're there to be looked at and adventured, that's what kind of keeps you going. I don't know what do you think you would be doing if you didn't have wilderness or you didn't have room to roam? Say we didn't have all these, great mountains and places to kind of get away from folks. That's always something that's haunted me. If that were to happen, it's not going to happen. I'm just saying, if it was,
it's really tough because, Will Primos had that quote in the Linguist film that just came out by Sitka, and he says, teach people to love something and they will protect it.
Right. That's a great quote.
And I really think it's hard to love the wilderness. It's hard to love deer. It's hard to really truly love elk or truly love cougar or whatever. If you aren't out in it and cleansing your soul there, and so I feel like if you're not out there in it and you're one of those people that's spent all this time in a city, for example, and you've never really struggled in the wilderness before, spent a night out there, it's hard for that person to grasp or understand what it is that we're talking about now.
Yeah.
And what we love. And in return, it's hard for them to protect it. Mm-hmm. Because without experiencing it and being part of it, it's hard to have a love for it, so you don't protect it. It's a circle, right? And I feel like often, their only experience is the downtown restaurant in Seattle.
Yeah.
And so they put a lot of value in that, and they protect that because it's what they know, and they value that. I just feel like as I read this book and others that it makes me really question what I perceive as valuable and important. And those things are and Aaron and I kind of live that lifestyle. We don't have big fancy houses, especially Snyder. We don't own a lot of really impressive stuff, but we have a lot of free time and freedom to go out and experience the natural world on a basis that's far more frequent than the average person.
Sure.
And my goal, my one thing I want is I feel like the more people that go out and experience it, the more that can get out and do it, and the more often that they do it, it's just like teaching them to love it, then they'll protect it. And I look at the world today, where we're at with conservation. Talk to Shane Mahoney about how many human beings are on the planet today. It doesn't take a lot of stretches in math to see when you got X billion people and they all have a kid, and then they have a kid and they have a kid, there's X billion people.
Sure.
And we're a very one species planet if you truly look at it. The amount of humans, I think, what did they say? I know that based on recent studies, there's 1 million black bears in North America. You're like, ooh, 1 million black bears. How many humans are in North America?
Yeah.
It's astronomical.
Yeah, a few more million than that.
But yeah, I mean, and the problem.
What are there? How many billion do we have on the planet? Is it 8 billion we got on the planet?
Something 7 billion, 8 billion, I think.
I get something like that.
There's not in 1 million black bear.
And just 1 million.
We achieved. There's 1 million black bear on the planet. This is great. When you really look at it, humans make up most of the planet, and it's kind of scary when you really think about the dominance that we have, and like Shane has said, the only it used to be that wild places existed just because they existed, and animals did too. But today, there's not a single wild place or wild animal that exists without deliberate human intention to make it exist.
Sure. Yeah.
That's kind of scary.
It is.
If people are out of touch with the natural world and what's out there, and they don't value it like you and I are talking about, it's going to be very difficult for them to then deliberately make it exist. Because whether that little songbird goes extinct or doesn't, they really don't care.
Right.
They think they do conceptually, but their actions don't.
Yeah, that's just it. It's their actions. Those usually don't mesh with how they talk. And, that's one thing that, my wife's crowd, I've talked about my wife's crowd many times, right?
Yeah.
It's a different crowd than you and mine. Our community is a little bit different. We think differently. We have different values, I guess. Her crowd is more of the city dwelling.
I like to
crowd.
think I have both our crowd and her crowd.
Do you have some of her crowd in you? Well, yeah. There's a lot of people. Back when I used to go to the parties and stuff and hang out with these these foreign people that I just had no commonalities with. It's pretty interesting. It just as simple as camping. They could be like, oh, you go camping, huh? Okay. Why? They just have no clue. Like, really? Why? There are bugs out there and it's dirty. Those people don't place a value on these places, and yet there's a great opportunity right now, which you're doing, we're trying to do with our little community, is spread that word, trying to get people to place a little more value. Public lands is a hot topic right now, wild places and public lands, and I think it's kind of infiltrating some of those city dwellers. In a way, it's getting talked about a little bit more, just in our circles. We're definitely, it seems to be kind of making its way through there, and they're kind of seeing, why we like these places. And that just be, I think hunters and hikers and, just adventure seekers, they all need to be a little more vigilant these days. You kind of have to be, as far as just not vigilant, but expressing why they like these places and maybe taking guys out and showing them these places.
Right.
There's so many dang young kids these days. I see it in the kids that we hire for my work. They have never had opportunity to go out and even go for an overnight camping trip in the backcountry or doesn't even have to be the backcountry. They rarely have had opportunities to even get out there and camp by a river. And so, taking these little guys out and just showing them an overnighter, teaching them kind of why we like it, showing them a cool hike into a lake somewhere, catching them some fish. All of a sudden they see it for, a little bit of what we like.
Right.
And maybe that'll translate and they'll do a little more of it.
Yeah.
And I've noticed that with my group, just the workers that work for us.
Yep.
All of a sudden they develop a liking, like bringing back some mushrooms and saying, hey, have you ever tried these? You know where you'd even find them? And taking a mushroom hunt or something like that. And all of a sudden, I think that is what it takes to get them to develop that little bit of respect for places like, where you and I like to be and venture. And it's kind of on everybody these days, because it's really easy for these young kids to get sucked into staying in the city, staying on, social media and watching television, and not ever taking the opportunity to get out and enjoy the public lands or just getting out by a river or a lake somewhere.
Yep.
But
I agree. And I think, little by little, that's why I like it when people share photos done well and video done well on hunts, and because I think it does influence and impact your local circle of friends, and everybody's is a little different. And some of those people that might harbor negative feelings toward the outdoors or hunters in general that don't really quite understand what it is we're about, they're able to go, oh, well, George is a nice guy, and he just brought us some salmon, and he smoked it himself.
That's really all it takes.
And all of a sudden, it changes the course of the future,
right?
One little person at a time. So I think it's very powerful, and I think it's neat to see. Plus, I just enjoy other people's stories done well.
Sure. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and like Hill's story, she's not a hunter, but she's developing a such a respect for guys for the things that we love and the things that we do, and just the web of people that you can affect one person and kind of show them our community and show them how cool we are and show them what we love to do and why we love it, and all of a sudden it's like a web. She tells her friends are getting are buying in, and they're realizing it. And it really does spread like wildfire, in certain communities. And we have a perfect opportunity right now to be doing that for sure. Yeah.
Well, I really enjoyed the book. I'm glad you read it because, I often read books and then I'm like, I got no one to talk about them with.
Yeah, it was good, man. I appreciated you turning me on to that one. Yeah, it really got me thinking. And it's funny, after you read a book like that, I always kind of revert back to little stories amongst it. And I find myself even weeks after just thinking back on it and relating to little stories that happened back then and thinking about what it would have been like versus, how it is today.
Yeah. Definitely gives me, it does trigger some sadness for me because of the way the world was before, in terms of its
how wild it was.
You still had passenger pigeons, and you still had these animals that aren't with us anymore.
Sure.
And and cultures that aren't with us anymore.
Yep.
Really. And so it's in their values, and so it's kind of interesting, and I think it's good to talk about these things because there's a lot of value in lessons learned from history. So.
Yep, absolutely. I agree. Yeah, it was a good book. Yeah, really enjoyed it. I think a lot of people, especially folks that are kind of, in our community, would probably enjoy looking back and seeing what happened back then and kind of how things were. And
I think it's good to know your own country's history too, and put things in context. Like, it's very interesting to see now. Okay, this is where Daniel Boone fits in. This is where George Washington fits in. And here's Benjamin Franklin. Here's, and you start looking at the independence of our country and the Civil War and all the different parts, the pieces. And it allows me to see things in a more informed way, and which then, helps me, understand the world a little more.
Yeah. Yeah. And, after going through something like that, now I find myself looking for more books kind of in the next era. I want to figure out, You know, whether it's, you know, Crazy Horse. I want to learn all about that and kind of his perspective and, you know, how that all changed. And, yeah, you can really get sucked into these things and start to enjoy it and just get immersed in it and want to learn
There's
more.
a lot. I mean, some of them are you know, history's full of harrowing, awesome adventures that just, you're like, wow, that blows my mind. And then it's full of sad stories and losses. And but one of those books that I said we were talking about before, I like American Serengeti. You got to read that one.
Yeah, I'm going to get into that one.
I really did like The Journey of Crazy Horse by Joseph Marshall.
Yeah, that one looks good.
Third, The River of Doubt. Told you about that one.
River of Doubt. No, I don't know about that one.
Theodore Roosevelt.
Oh, okay.
Floating the Amazon River.
Oh.
Exploring an uncharted river through the Amazon rainforest. It's fascinating. But one thing I can say about, you know, as I read these stories about remarkable people, you know, I was shooting bows with Cameron Haynes at one of the events, and he was saying to me, he's like, I am truly fascinated by anyone who is you know, a remarkable human being or someone who is at the top of their craft or a craft, whether it's, you know, whatever, sewing or whether it's CrossFit Games, right? Like, what is it that makes them so good? You know, Tim Ferriss is kind of like that. That's kind of what his gig is, right? He's like interviewing people that are the best of the best in what they do, and kind of unlooking,
getting into the mind of these people and how they get to that point, how they get so good.
When you read, you know, like Crazy Horse, or you read this one with Theodore Roosevelt, one thing it does tell me, and the same thing with Daniel Boone, is it's like, you know, lessons learned per se. It's like, I think of Daniel Boone as, I think about these people and I'm like, hey, I'm far more capable of doing great things than I think I am. Right? Like, the human mind and spirit is a remarkable thing. And sometimes I think we quit or back down way too early. And we're capable of doing some things, whether it's ideals or thoughts or physical accomplishments. We're capable of so much difference and making a difference, and yet we so often quit.
Yeah, and that's pretty sad because, when you do kind of pay attention to the way it was back then, you quickly realize how good we have it now and how easy we have it now. We're just a bunch of, you know, sissies when it comes
softer than baby poo.
Yeah, exactly. Traipsing through wilderness with the equipment they had versus what we have now. We got no excuses.
Yeah, I get that all the time. Like, people will say something about Aaron and I, our gear list and stuff, and they'll, I don't know, say something like, you know, back in the day, they were able to do it without this and this and this, so you don't need all that stuff. But to that I say, Ryan, yeah, you can backpack without a tent, but why would you want to?
Definitely. Nope. Use the technology, but just don't whine about it.
Yeah.
Because there were tougher times.
That's right. All right, man. I appreciate you coming on the podcast.
Absolutely.
Appreciate it. It's always good
fun.
hanging out.
Appreciate it.
Check out Ryan at ST Healthy Hunter on Instagram and Hunt Harvest Health Podcast. It's good stuff. Keep it up. Thanks, man.
Stay gritty.
Stay gritty.